Welcome in to the fourth draft. I'm your host, Erin Trafford, and I'm so happy you are here. I also have to say, I have been overwhelmed by how well this show has been doing within the circle of Canadian media folks and podcast curious folks and all of you who have been Story Studio Network and now Echo Podcast Network supporters. Honestly, I always appreciate the responses, the reviews, the subscribing to the feeds, all those things. But it also really never gets old for me when someone says they've listened to or caught an episode. So this is me starting this episode with nothing but intense gratitude for you. Because you know, I'm doing this off the side of my desk as the CEO of a company. And I do it because I love it. And I do it because it makes me feel good. So knowing it makes you feel good is like icing on the cake. So listen, I had a totally different plan for this episode, and I sort of threw the plans out the window because I don't know if you've been paying attention, and if you haven't, that's okay. That's what I'm here for. But there has been so much movement in the Canadian media landscape in the last, 2 weeks, that I am having trouble keeping up. So if I am having trouble keeping up, then I'm sure you are having trouble keeping up. So I will attempt to fill you in, and I'm not going to do it all in one episode because it would be like through a fire hose. So we're going to just piecemeal this over the next couple of episodes, because the critical thing here is that I think in order to have a real conversation about where Canadian media needs to go, we need to have a real conversation about where we are now and how we got here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on why I want to have this. This is important to talk about now. So at Story Studio Network right now, as I record this, we are in the middle of planning our first ever executive retreat. I know it like feels so fancy. I'm like, who am I? We're having an executive retreat. Oh, it feels very fancy. And everybody's flying here to Nova Scotia. Well, some people are flying to Nova Scotia, and we are also on the books is another full team retreat in the spring, which also just feels like, what? How did I get here? How do I have a company where we're doing this? It's amazing. But what we're going to do over the next 4 weeks at the executive level is the question I really want to wrestle with is, who do we want to be in the market right now? And how do we want to show up? And I know for some companies, and if you are an entrepreneur yourself, or you've worked in marketing or sales or whatever, you know that that's a really important question to ask, but B, it's a really simplistic position to take at a company retreat. But here's why. Originally when we planned this a few months ago, it was going to be all about how are we working with clients? It was going to be a much more deep dive kind of retreat. And we've had to pull it back and go back to basics and say, okay, wait a minute. Who do we actually want to be in the market? Because when we entered the market in 2021, I say that, after a text message, Story Studio Network formed, we were in an entirely different environment as media professionals. We were still in the middle of COVID. So budgets looked different, marketing looked different, communications looked different, expectations looked different, the media acted differently. And now here we are to end of 2023, and it's like the world has changed completely. So we're taking this opportunity at SSN to go back to basics and say, oh my goodness, given everything that's gone on around us, who do we need to be now? And how do we want to show up? So yes, we are still and ever will be a podcast production company and network. That's not going to change. We will always help people and brands produce their podcasts in the best way for them and get it out into the world. We do that incredibly well. And I'm excited to see how we're able to continue doing that in new and exciting ways. I've also recently learned through doing some market research that we're able to do that rather economically. So now I'm like, do we raise our prices? I still want podcasting to be accessible, FYI. So that's not going to change. That's not what we're going to really be digging into at the retreat. But we are also recognizing 2 years in, given all that's changed in the landscape, that we are actually a media company at heart. And I think that simply by virtue of who we all were before SSN happened. So if we talk about the value that we bring to the market, it's through incredibly well-produced podcasts and an incredible team of executors on the ground. But if we talk about who we are in our hearts and what we value and the ethos that we bring to the Canadian market and how we want to show up, my feeling is, and we're going to dig into this together when we're all in one place, is that we really do need to take a stand on what's happening in the media. Because in some way, shape, or form, we all here at the team have this personal vocational tie to the business of news and information. And to sit here leading this company with the bench strength that I have on my team in the environment that we're in and not try to make this all mean something, I think would be a wasted opportunity. So I say this at the beginning of today's episode to let you know, like, we are actively evolving the brand because brands are living, breathing things. They're not static. We know that. And we're looking to refine our mission based on what's happening, right? We're not pivoting, we're refining it. So we'll always be this podcast production company, but I want to clarify how this is going to help us as Canadians a little bit more, because back in 2021, I'll be blunt, the Canadian media needed help back then, but it did not need as much help as it needs now. It sure as heck didn't. So there's a few things that we're going to start looking at in 2024 to help enhance this. And one of them is doing live podcast recording. So I am actively looking at where I can be doing some episodes of the Fourth Draft and inviting you to come hang out while we have these conversations and be steeped in the podcasting world, because I think that is an avenue for new media. I think that the concept of touching your audience, like literally making eye contact with an audience, is going to be critical to new media models. And I'm talking to people who are running very large media organizations right now who are looking at how do we add live podcasting, live studio audiences back into our media model. So that's super fun. We're going to try and test that out. And if you have ideas, I'm all ears. Please let me know. Drop me an email, hello@storystudionetwork.com, or find me on social, Instagram, it's.Erin Trafford, or over on LinkedIn. I'm quite active over there too. All this to say is my point here is that we need to, I think I need to, be better at advocating for our Canadian media. And we need to not necessarily tell them what to say or overregulate them, but I think we need to recognize that it is critical to, I mean, we say democracy, yes, democracy, but also just the fabric of culture, that we have a thriving, healthy, competitive media landscape. So these are the conversations I want to have over the next few episodes. And I'm going to be calling on some conversations I've had with other folks to really dig into these. So I'm going to set the scene today. Next episode, we're going to talk to my team because I want their take on this. FYI, I have not told them this is where I want to go yet. And they're really great at that. Like, I kind of drop it into the room during our team meeting and then see what their response is. So the next episode, we'll hear from Team SSN on a lot of this. But then I'm going to start really explaining what I'm hearing from other folks. So this is a bit of a three-parter. So let's set the scene. Why do I feel like now is the time for companies like mine and companies like ours to tackle this beast and position ourselves as new media companies? There's three things that we need to look at. Number one is this uniquely Canadian challenge that we're finding that exists in our media world. It is unique to Canada, and therefore, I think the solution will be unique to Canada. I also think, just based on conversations, that there is a general lack of understanding of the depth and the tentacles of Bill C-18 and its little sister or little brother sibling, Bill C-11. We need to better understand that. And then I think those two things combined means that we have to get a little bit better at anticipating what our media landscape could look like in a doomsday scenario in 2 to 3 years and what we want it to look like in 2 to 3 years. Because I got to tell you, in the grand scheme of things, 2 to 3 years is not a long time. So if we want to change the narrative and we want to change the landscape, now is the time to act. So let's back this up for a second. As we head into our corporate retreat and we're talking about what I want to be and how I think we need to be a media company that also produces podcasts, is this unique Canadian challenge. And I'm not sure if you caught it. I was on the Sound Off podcast this past week with host Matt Kundle. He's done incredible things for podcasting in Canada. He has one of the largest podcast networks in the country. Dude knows what he's talking about. He knows podcasting. He knows media. He knows the players. He understands the landscape. So he and I had an hour-long deep dive, and I'll place the link to listen to that episode in the show notes for this show. And I would encourage you to have a listen and reach out to him. But we got to talking about how Canada is it's an odd duck, right? We're not the UK. Even though the UK has the BBC and we have the CBC, there are some very fundamental differences there. The number one being funding. The UK gets funding from the Crown, or rather the BBC gets funding from the Crown, but then cannot sell advertising. Our CBC gets funding from the federal government, but then can sell advertising. So changes the competitive landscape, creates a unique Canadian challenge when there are other smaller independent organizations trying to compete with the CBC. And I'm not saying we should abolish the CBC. I'm not getting into that. What I'm saying is I'm trying to paint a picture here for you of the unique Canadian challenge we're in, right? The very nature of that changes the way Canadian media manages itself and the way media is consumed, sold, monetized, profits are created, and all of those things. Changes the dynamic. The other thing that changes the dynamic in the Canadian respect is the fact that we are a stone's throw. We are an imaginary line in the sand away from the United States. And so what has happened as our Canadian media has been consolidated, as podcasting has taken hold, as networks have developed, as new forms of programmatic advertising have been brought in, is that we are often compared to the Americans in terms of size, scope, revenue generation ability, the size of our audience. And that is to our detriment. That is to our detriment because we can never compete with them purely on population. The population of Canada is less than the population of California. So for us as media folk to go after American dollars without an American-sized audience is a losing proposition. And yet, that is where we find ourselves for the most part when we're out there trying to pitch our value is, well, you only have, and I'm pulling this number out of thin air for sake of example, but they'll say you only have 5,000 people listening when XYZ show has 50,000 people listening. Well, XYZ show has 45,000 Americans and 5,000 Canadians. So that's how these conversations are happening. This is a problem facing Canadian media. This is a problem that I think the solution is going to be strong advocacy for the value of a Canadian solution, which I don't think exists yet. So this whole idea of the CBC having a kind of straddling both worlds, there for the public good, but also there for profit and being a juggernaut, right? There's nothing the CBC can't do with $1 billion. There's no other media corporation that has that kind of budget to do things with, right? So they are always going to be the best, but nobody's going to be able to compete with them because they're the best and they're eating from both pies, right? So there's that. Then there's this whole idea of that Canada is consistently compared to the United States on multiple fronts, none of which seems to make logical sense. Okay. So that's challenge number one, that we need to understand if we're going to have this conversation about how to fix the problem. And I go in a little deeper depth on this in my episode with Matt. So go listen to that if you've got some extra time. We hit on that in the second half of the episode. The second thing and this is related, is this whole mess. It's an absolute unmitigated disaster that has happened with Bill C-18. And I'm bringing this up because I have had so many conversations with industry folks who are shaking their head, who are, gnashing their teeth over it because we understand what it's done. In some cases, people's revenue dropped 30% overnight. How are you supposed to run an operation if 30% of your revenue evaporates overnight? This is a disaster for independent media and small media organizations in the country. So A. B, I've had multiple conversations with folks not in the media at all, just regular people who would say, I don't know, I just consume media like a regular person, who literally do not understand what has happened, why it has happened, why it has persisted, or who's going to fix it. And that's nobody's fault. Except I would say the government and the media, but the general public just don't understand what happened. So to give you a little bit of primer, C-18 dropped in July and effectively was the government playing chicken with Meta, Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook and Instagram. And what they wanted to do, they thought they were helping. They thought they were helping by suggesting that Meta was getting all this traffic from Canadian news sources. So why doesn't Meta start paying for all of that traffic? And Meta said, we don't need that. We don't need to pay. There's a whole bunch of other things on there where the government didn't put a cap on how much they would ever have to pay. So the potential for them to pay was like quite literally like an immeasurable amount of money every year. No business would go into that deal. No business would say, yeah, absolutely, I'll pay this fee without having any sense of how big that fee would be year over year. The government didn't see it that way. They're like, no, you just have to pay this fee and pay it whatever it is every year. That's crazy town. So they said, screw you. We're just going to not let you post any of those links. If we have to pay for that, we're not letting you do that. We don't want to pay for that. So see ya. Service-based business pulled right out. Now Canadians have no news on Facebook. Now Canadians have no news on Instagram. And we saw closures, newsroom closures, salespeople are being laid off left, right, and center, which doesn't make headline news either, but I can tell you that that's happening. It is an unmitigated disaster for Canadian media and for Canadians getting access to information. And let's just put aside when actual disasters like wildfires or tornadoes or hurricanes happen, and Canadians over the last 15 years have been trained to go to these sources to get up-to-date information, no longer can. That's a whole different issue. That's a whole different issue. So we need to better understand what happened with C-18. And the reason I say that is because the third point we need to start unpacking is what's going to happen in 2 to 3 years. Because I say if we're looking at 2 to 3 years, we don't have a long horizon. And what could happen in 2 to 3 years is that the government will do the same thing they did with digital publishers and C-18 to streaming publishers with C-11. So C-18 is called the Online News Act, and C-11 is called the Online Streaming Act. What they're going to attempt to do, they're in consultations right now, but hello, there's a little bit of a lack of trust at this point that they're even going to listen to consultations, because they didn't with C-18, is they're going after the Netflix, they're going after the Apples and the Spotifys, and probably where you're listening to this podcast right now. And they're going to try to regulate it. Whether that requires a fee payment like they tried with Meta and with Google, who knows? Whether that requires them to rewrite an algorithm to specifically uplift and uphold Canadian content, who knows? But what I see, if history is any indicator, is that if they're too strong-arming on this, is that these companies look at Canada as just a line item on their profit and loss statement. They are not invested in Canadian culture. They are not invested in Canada having a thriving media landscape built upon their algorithms and platforms. They don't care. They don't actually need us. So if the government makes it really hard for them to be here, they are going to walk away. That is a potential. And just to give you a number, that would mean that 18 months, 2 years from now, Apple and Spotify say, screw you, Canada. We're not making podcasts available to Canadians on our platforms because the government's going to make us pay extra fees. The government's going to force us to rewrite our algorithm. The government's going to force us to pay Canadian creators more than we think that they're worth at the end of the day. Blah, 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 blah. They're going to pull out. That's 80% of podcast streaming access in Canada if they do that. Not even to mention what could happen if they did it to a company like Netflix or any of those other Disney Plus, right? That is the quagmire we are in. That is where we are. Now, I have said this before and I'll say it again. I think innovation is going to be the way through, but now is the time to have these conversations. Now is the time. So to bring this all back around to the top, this is why I started this episode by saying, we have pivoted our focus at Story Studio Network. Absolutely. I'm digging my heels in and saying we are a podcast production company. Absolutely. We are going to refine our offer to the market in terms of how we're working with brands, in terms of how we're working with creators to bolster that Canadian content as much as possible to make sure that whatever storm is on the way, we can weather it. And I don't mean just we as a company. Obviously, I want my company to survive, but also we as Canadian creators, that we have the balance of power here, right? So we're going to focus on that. But given all that's happened, we're also focusing on who does SSN need to be in the face of all of these fire-breathing dragons? Who do we need to be? Who do I need to be? And then the question I'll pose to you is, who do you need to be? Who can you be in all of this? Because I think I said this in episode 1. Actually, I said this in the trailer. None of this happens without you. The audience is the most important in all of this. Otherwise, we're just talking heads, talking at each other in echo chambers about media things and revenue and advertising, but none of this matters if it's not about you. So who do you need to be as we march forward and advocate for the media culture that we want to have in this country? That is the question that I pose to you today. And it is the question that I will be posing to my team. I'm curious to hear what they think about all of this. I'll try to keep it concise, but you never know. But that's it for this episode. I hope it gave you some food for thought. Maybe I made you a little angry or a little shocked. Maybe you didn't know some of these things. I don't know. Let me know. Find me over on LinkedIn. Find me on the Instagrams. Email us, hello@storystudionetwork.com. And if you've got your phone in your hand, please don't forget to rate and review this program. It personally makes me so happy. So happy. And subscribe if you're on the Big Apple. Follow us if you're on the Spotifys. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Erin Trafford. This is The Fourth Draft.